The spring on Lena Thorvaldsen's property ran at 43 degrees Fahrenheit in July and 43 degrees in February, and she had known this since the first summer she arrived because she had measured it, and she had measured it because she intended to build something around it, and she intended to build something around it because she had seen, as a girl of 12 in the Gudbrandsdalen Valley of Norway, exactly what a properly built springhouse could do for a farm family that had no other means of keeping food cold. She began digging on November the 3rd, 1892. The ground in the driftless area of southwestern Wisconsin was not yet frozen. The first hard freeze had come on October 28th, but had not penetrated below 8 inches. 8 inches was enough to make digging difficult. It was not enough to stop her. The neighbors who passed on the county road and saw her working that first week, a woman of 32 in a canvas work coat, swinging a mattock into the rocky hillside above her property's spring seep, didn't understand what she was building. Some thought she was enlarging her root cellar. Some thought she had found something in the ground worth excavating. A few, correctly identifying the spring and the proximity of the work, simply thought she had taken leave of her practical senses, because November in southwestern Wisconsin was not a month that invited ground excavation, and because what she appeared to be doing, enclosing a cold water spring in some kind of structure for the purpose of food storage, was something none of them had ever seen attempted in the county. They laughed in the way that people laugh when they believe they are watching a mistake being made. Gently, mostly. Without meanness. With the superior confidence of people who have never needed to revise their assumptions about what works. Lena heard about it at the general store in Soldiers Grove and said nothing. She had been hearing about assumptions all her life. She was the daughter of Christopher Thorvaldsen, a small-scale dairy farmer from the Gudbrandsdalen Valley who had built his farm's springhouse when Lena was 9, and who had spent the following 3 years explaining it to her in the exacting detail of a man who had thought carefully about every decision he'd made. Christopher's springhouse used a small seepage spring on the farm's north-facing hillside, channeling a trickle of 41-degree groundwater through a stone-lined channel that ran beneath a flagstone floor, keeping the enclosed air above the channel at a consistent 44 to 46 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of the season. In summer, that was 20 to 30 degrees cooler than the outdoor air. In winter, it was 10 to 15 degrees warmer than freezing, safely above the point where dairy products and preserved vegetables would be damaged by cold. A springhouse was not a cold cellar. A cold cellar used the Earth's thermal mass to maintain temperature. A springhouse used the Earth's thermal mass, plus the constant thermal input of groundwater emerging at a steady temperature year-round. The two combined produced something more reliable than either alone, a space that was cool in summer, frost-protected in winter, and stable across all seasons, without any active management beyond keeping the channel clear. The spring on Lena's Wisconsin property was better than her father's Norway spring in one important respect. It ran at a higher volume. Christopher's spring produced approximately 3 gallons per minute in dry conditions. Lena's produced 11. More flow meant more thermal stability. The greater the volume of 43-degree water moving through the channel, the less effect the ambient air temperature could have on the enclosed space above it. 11 gallons per minute of 43-degree water moving through a properly built stone channel under a properly built structure would hold the interior of that structure between 40 and 46 degrees Fahrenheit through a Wisconsin winter with the regularity of a machine. She had calculated this from her father's data, adjusted for the higher flow rate, and she trusted the calculation the way she trusted arithmetic in general, completely because arithmetic did not have opinions. The site she had chosen was the natural amphitheater where the spring seep emerged from the hillside, a slight concavity in the rock face where the groundwater seeped through a fracture zone in the limestone, sheeting down the rock face and collecting in a small pool before running off downslope. The natural enclosure of the hillside on 3 sides meant that 2 of her 4 walls were already largely provided by the landscape. She needed to build only the front wall and the roof, and to excavate the interior space to a depth sufficient to make it workable. The excavation took 14 days. She was working in rock, the driftless area's characteristic limestone, which fracture drilled easily with a steel bar and a hammer, but did not yield to a spade the way soil did. She worked in the morning hours when the light was best, broke for midday, and worked again until the light failed at 4:30 in November's short days. The rock she removed she piled to the right of the excavation and used it as the building material for the front wall, fitting the irregular limestone pieces in dry stack construction without mortar. The same method she had watched her father use in Norway, where the limestone of the Gudbrandsdalen Valley had the same characteristic tendency to split into roughly flat-faced pieces that stacked without requiring cutting or mortar to hold plumb. Dry stacked limestone, no mortar, no cost, no mixing in November cold when mortar wouldn't cure properly anyway. The stones fitted themselves by their own weight and the careful selection of each piece. Her father had taught her to think of dry stack construction as a conversation between the builder and the available material. You didn't force the stones into a predetermined pattern. You asked each stone what it was capable of and placed it accordingly. The wall she built across the front of the excavation was 18 inches thick at the base, tapering to 12 at the top, 4 feet tall, with a door opening of 24 inches, wide enough to carry in a crock with both hands. The door itself she built from rough-sawn oak boards, 2 layers thick with a gap between filled with dry sawdust she had obtained from the mill in Soldier's Grove. The sawdust functioning as an insulating dead air medium that gave the door an effective R value of approximately R4. Not impressive by modern standards, but sufficient to prevent freeze intrusion through the one vulnerable element in an otherwise stone and earth enclosure. The roof she built from split limestone slabs, flat pieces she had found in the excavated material, selected for their width and thickness, laid across oak poles that spanned the width of the interior. The stone slabs weighed approximately 20 pounds per square foot, which was significantly heavier than any conventional roofing material and required the oak spanning poles to be sized accordingly. She used 4-inch diameter oak, spaced 8 inches apart, which she calculated would carry the stone load with a safety factor of approximately 2 to 1. The poles came from the property's oak woodlot. The calculation came from watching her father do the same thing on a smaller scale. 3 people in the community had objections substantial enough to voice directly, and they voiced them because they were genuinely concerned rather than contemptuous. The distinction being important because genuine concern deserves genuine answers. The first was Halvor Stensgaard, age 67, the county's oldest practicing farmer and the closest thing the driftless settlement had to an institutional memory of what worked and what didn't. He had been farming in the county since 1847, 45 years, and had seen more schemes succeed and fail than most people had heard of. He was not a man who dismissed things out of hand. He was a man who required demonstration. He stopped at the excavation on November 9th and watched Lena work for several minutes before speaking. "The spring will ice over in January," he said. "Below zero for 2 weeks, that seep freezes. Your channel freezes. Your thermal input goes to 0, and your building is just a cold box with no door worth the name." It was the most technical objection anyone raised, and it was informed by something real. In extreme Wisconsin cold, surface springs could and did freeze. He had seen it. The question was whether the spring in question would freeze, or whether its flow rate and depth of origin would protect it. Lena had investigated this before beginning the project. She had dug down alongside the seep the previous spring to a depth of 3 feet, where the spring's fracture zone was exposed, and had confirmed that the water emerged from the fracture at a temperature of 43 degrees, even at 3 feet of depth. A spring feeding from a fracture at 3 feet would freeze only if the surrounding rock was frozen to that depth, which required a sustained surface temperature of approximately 25 below zero Fahrenheit for 2 or more weeks. Conditions that had occurred in the driftless area perhaps 3 times in recorded history and had not occurred in the previous 20 years. She also planned to insulate the channel itself, a layer of straw bales over the channel's exposed surface between the seep origin and the springhouse wall, replacing the straw each autumn to maintain its insulating value. "The fracture is at 3 feet, she said. "It would take 25 below for 2 weeks to freeze it. Has that happened in your 45 years here?" Stensgaard thought about it. "Once," he said. 1856, early in my time." "Once in 45 years, she said. "I'll take the odds." He nodded slowly. He was a man who respected arithmetic when it was applied to actual conditions rather than theoretical ones. The second voice was Astrid Nygaard, age 50, who operated the county's only commercial cheese operation and who had spent 20 years thinking about food preservation at a scale that gave her opinion on the subject genuine authority. She was not hostile to the idea of a springhouse. She had seen one, she said, in Pennsylvania during a journey east in 1878. Her objection was specific to the scale and the season. "November construction," she said, sitting at Lena's kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in mid-November, examining the pencil drawings Lena had made of the completed structure. "You can't get mortar to cure in November. Your wall will move in the first freeze cycle." "No mortar," Lena said. She slid the drawing across the table. "Dry stack." Astrid looked at the drawing for a moment. Dry stack limestone. She understood the principle. She had seen it in fieldstone walls across the county. But dry stack in a structural wall bearing a stone roof with groundwater running beneath it? "The ground below will heave," she said. "Freeze-thaw under a wet foundation moves stone. By spring, you'll have a leaning wall." It was a legitimate concern. Frost heave, the expansion of soil moisture during a freeze cycle, could shift an unmortared stone wall if the foundation soil was wet enough to freeze and expand. The question was whether the foundation soil at Lena's springhouse site was subject to frost heave, and the answer she had determined was no, because the continuous flow of 43-degree spring water through the channel kept the soil beneath and around the foundation above freezing at all times. Frozen soil was the condition required for frost heave. Lena's foundation soil was never frozen. She explained this to Astrid, who sat with her hands around a coffee cup and worked through the logic. "The spring water keeps the foundation above freezing," Astrid said to confirm she had followed it. "Year-round," Lena said. "The same property that makes it a food storage building also protects the foundation." Astrid set down her cup. "That's elegant," she said, which was not a word she used often, and which, from Astrid Nygaard, meant something. She became, over the following months, the most vocal advocate for the springhouse in the settlement, not from sentimentality, but from the commercial interest of a cheese producer who recognized that the design solved a problem she had been working around for 20 years. The third skeptic was a younger man, Eric Halverson, age 34, who farmed the neighboring property to the south, and who was, in most respects, a practical and open-minded person. His objection was about the November timing specifically, and it was framed as concern rather than criticism. "You're going to be working whetstone in below-freezing temperatures," he said when he stopped by the excavation on November the 14th. A whetstone in a freeze is a slipping stone. One of those slabs comes down on your hands while you're fitting it, and you're in trouble. Alone on this property, with no one expecting to check on you. He was not wrong about the safety risk. Wet limestone in freezing temperatures was more slippery than dry limestone, and a stone slab weighing 40 pounds, shifted during placement in cold hands wearing stiff gloves, had the potential to cause a serious injury. Lena had thought about this. She had responded to the risk by modifying her method. She worked the heavier roof slabs only when the temperature was above freezing and the stone surface was dry. And she had arranged with Eric himself, though she had not told him this was part of her planning, to bring a side of cured pork to his family on the 17th and the 24th of November, which gave her a reason to be seen alive and functional on a regular schedule that would surface a problem within a week if she failed to appear. "I'm delivering pork to your family on the 17th, she said. He looked at her for a moment. "That's not an answer to the question. It's the answer to the version of the question that matters," she said. He considered this and concluded correctly that it was a reasonable safety protocol. He helped her with the 2 heaviest roof slabs on November the 19th, without being asked, which was its own kind of answer. The accounts of practical ingenuity embedded in individual lives, the quiet, unglamorous problem-solving of people building something real with what they had. These are the stories that the historical record consistently fails to preserve. If this account is finding you, please subscribe and leave a like. It matters that these solutions get documented. The springhouse was complete and functional by November the 24th, 1892. The interior temperature on completion day, measured with the glass thermometer Lena had placed on a shelf inside, 44 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, 29 degrees, a 15-degree differential on a day when the ambient temperature was already below freezing. She moved the first load of stores in on November 26th. 2 crocks of sweet cream butter, 1 5-pound round of hard cheese, 3 crocks of pickled vegetables, 1 crock of lard, and 4 pounds of cured pork shoulder she had hung from an oak peg she had driven into the ceiling beam. The total store represented approximately 60% of her winter dairy and preserved food supply. The remainder she kept in the root cellar as a hedge, same as every careful person would do when trying something new. The Wisconsin winter of 1892 to 1893 was not the worst the state had experienced, but it was not mild. The January mean temperature for the driftless area was 8 degrees Fahrenheit, with 12 nights below zero and 2 nights at 15 below. The spring did not freeze. The channel ran clear through every cold period. Lena checked the interior temperature weekly and recorded it in her household ledger. 43 degrees in December, 42 in January at the worst, 44 in February as the ground began its slow warming, a 2-degree variation across the full winter. The butter was firm and clean tasting in March. The hard cheese had its rind intact, its interior dense and dry and precisely what it had been in November. The pickled vegetables were sealed and sound. The cured pork had developed a slight surface bloom, a harmless secondary mold that she wiped off with a cloth dampened in vinegar before using, which was the only sign of imperfection in the entire stored supply. Total loss from the springhouse, 0. Total loss from the root cellar, approximately 9%, due to 2 weeks of temperature fluctuation in late January, when a series of warming days, followed by a sharp refreeze, had driven moisture through the cellar's north wall seam and softened the rinds on the 2 hard cheese rounds stored there. Halvor Stensgaard came to see the springhouse in March, when the winter's evidence was complete and available for inspection. He stood inside the 4-foot by 6-foot interior. It was too small to stand upright for a man of his height, and he examined it in a half-crouch and ran his hands along the dry stack wall, tested the roof slabs for movement, looked at the channel running beneath the flagstone floor where the spring water made its quiet passage. He looked at the thermometer. 43 degrees. March 12th. He spent perhaps 10 minutes in there before he came out and straightened up slowly in the cold air outside. "Your father built one of these," he said. "In Norway," she said, "in the 1860s. He looked at the structure for a while in the way of a man who has spent 45 years learning what works and has just seen one more thing added to the list. "Should have been built 40 years ago," he said. It was not directed at Lena. It was directed at the 45 years of Wisconsin winter he had managed without one. Astrid Newgard began planning her own springhouse in April 1893. She had a spring on her property that she had previously used only for stock watering, a reliable seep on the north slope of her cheese operation, flowing at approximately 6 gallons per minute at a temperature she measured in April at 41 degrees. Not as vigorous as Lena's spring, but sufficient for the design. She spent 4 evenings at Lena's kitchen table in May, working through the construction questions with a notepad, and she built her spring house in June using a mason she hired for the mortared section of the work. She did not attempt dry stack, which she correctly identified as requiring a specific kind of tactile knowledge she had not yet developed, and she paid $3 for 2 days of the mason's labor. Astrid's spring house was larger than Lena's, 8 feet by 10 feet, 6 feet interior height, with a stone-flagged floor and a timber frame roof covered with earth and sod. The larger interior volume required more thermal management, and she added a secondary insulated door, Lena's sawdust-filled oak construction, which she copied precisely, plus a simple wooden rack system for hanging cured meats from the ceiling beams, adapted from the arrangement Lena had used for the pork shoulder. In the winter of 1893 to 1894, Astrid's spring house held 42 degrees through January, 41 through February. Her cheese losses for the winter, 0. Her previous winter's losses, using conventional cold cellar storage, 14%. Eric Halverson, who had helped with the heavy roof slabs in November 1892 and who had quietly filed away what he observed, built his own spring house in the summer of 1894. He modified the channel design based on a wet winter experience he had the first autumn. The spring on his property had a higher silt content than Lena's, and the channel tended to develop silt deposits that reduced flow in wet periods. He addressed this with a settling basin, a small stone box placed upstream of the main channel, in which silt could settle before the water entered the springhouse. It was a modest improvement. He mentioned it to Lena on a June visit, and she installed a settling basin of her own the following autumn. That is how it works. Each person who builds on the foundation adds one thing. The accumulated result is better than what any one person could have built alone. If you've stayed with this account to its final mile, I'm grateful. Please take a second to like this video. It's the simplest way to make sure these stories find the people who want them. Lena Thorvaldsen's spring house stood on the Wisconsin property until 1931, when it was demolished by the family that had purchased the land in 1908 to make room for an expansion of the barn. By 1931, electric refrigeration was available in rural Wisconsin, and the spring house's function had been superseded by technology that required no construction skill, no spring, and no November excavation in limestone, only a monthly electric bill. The demolition was practical and unremarkable, and did not generate any record that anyone thought to preserve. But the spring house as a technology did not disappear. It retreated as practical knowledge retreats into the background of the culture, present in older farms that still had functioning springs, maintained by the kind of farmer who understood its value and who did not decommission a zero-cost system simply because an electric cost alternative had become available. As of the early 2000s, the National Register of Historic Places contains documented spring houses in 17 states, the oldest dating to the 18th century, the most recent constructed in the 1940s. In the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, where the limestone geology produces springs of exceptional consistency and volume, springhouses have been in continuous agricultural use since the first European settlement of the valley in the 1730s, a span of nearly 300 years, across which the technology has been exactly the same, because the physics have never changed, and there has never been a reason to change what the physics produce for free. In Korea, the traditional ongi pot, the large earthenware vessel, stored partially buried in a hillside or courtyard to maintain a stable temperature for fermenting kimchi, applied the same principle of earth and groundwater as thermal regulators to food preservation, with documented use stretching back more than 1,000 years. In the Swiss Alps, the Keller, the cellar built into a stream-fed hillside below every traditional farmhouse, use spring-fed channels to cool dairy products through the summer months in exactly the way that Christopher Thorvaldsen had taught his daughter in the Gudbrandsdalen Valley, and that she had carried across the North Atlantic and pressed into the limestone of southwestern Wisconsin with a mattock and a November that was not quite frozen. The spring runs at 43 degrees. It always has. It always will. That was all she needed to know.